3 weeks of doing this video now, and I've had 2 great weeks of this video and 1 off week. I've got tons of conviction on these guys today. Before I get into it, I just ask you to go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So our first guy right here, Josh Downs, has everything changed for him this week because Joe Flacco comes in and saves the freaking day. Joe Flacco comes in and he's just immediately going to raise the upside of not only Josh Downs, every wide receiver in Indianapolis, but I'm going to make the case to you why it's Josh Downs. That's the guy that you want in Indianapolis this week for the Colts with Joe Flacco. So he's taking on the Minnesota Vikings on Sunday night in Minnesota this week, and each game with Flacco. I just want to put this in perspective for everybody. Josh Downs and Michael Pittman's with Joe Flacco, 3 games this year, that is to be exact. They have combined for at least 30 plus fantasy points in every single one of those matchups in a full PPR format. And out of those games with 30 plus points, this is Josh Downs specifically with Joe Flacco. 22.2 fantasy points, 15.9, and 19.5 in a full PPR format. So again, he's accounting for more than half of those points a lot of times when it combines him and Michael Pittman. So he has been the best fantasy option with Joe Flacco comparatively to Michael Pittman Jr. And it's very sustainable. This is not just a fluke. It's not like he's getting like 5 targets or 6 targets and he's ended up in the end zone once or twice every single one of those times. That's not the case here. With Joe Flacco, 9 targets, 12 targets, 9 targets for Josh Downs. This is actually the number 1 wide receiver for Joe Flacco, according to him. Joe Flacco loves throwing to Josh Downs, and Minnesota is 31st versus wide receivers in fantasy football. I love this matchup for Josh Downs, and this is just a side note. I also have said a bunch this week that the Colts are my favorite underdog pick. This week, if I'm a betting man with Vegas here, because they're major underdogs according to Vegas this week, I actually think the Colts could come out and win. I think they're going to show a lot of toughness because their starting quarterback just quit on them, and I think Josh Downs has a major game versus the Minnesota Vikings this week. Dropping down to our next guy right here, Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints at the Carolina Panthers. Now, I want to say this, ordinarily, Alvin Kamara is a must-start guy. Like, obviously, this guy has been in most people's lineups all year, so it doesn't really fit the need of the criteria to join this video with a guy like Josh Downs, right? Now, I have been a little bit tough on Alvin Kamara lately, and it's not because I don't like the player that Alvin Kamara still is. Obviously, I do. My concerns with him, this team has been riding him like a horse without Derek Carr. He's had like to play through tons of injuries already this year. He's got hand injuries, he's got lower body injuries, he's got rib injuries. This guy has not been able to get healthy this year. And without Derek Carr, in a full PPR format, which is going to be very important and distinct here in a little bit, 16.4 fantasy points, 8.4 fantasy points, and 18.2. Again, full PPR format. And if you just look at it on the surface, that's not a bad type. Those are not bad weeks that Alvin Kamara has been producing for you in a full PPR. Now, obviously, what's the thing that Alvin Kamara does? That's all based on receptions and targets. Because in a half PPR format, 14.9 fantasy points, still not bad. 5.4 fantasy points. That's a bust week in week 7. And then 15.2 fantasy points in a half PPR format. So again, I want to reiterate, most of the time you are starting Alvin Kamara. You are rarely pulling Alvin Kamara out of your starting lineup here. But this is, again, it just is important to note, a lot of that comes from his receiving upside. The targets were through the roof without Derek Carr. But with Derek Carr coming back this week by lots of accounts, I am telling you that the rushing upside is what's coming back this week. I'm not saying that he's going to get the reception work taken away from him. What I'm telling you, though, is that they will absolutely have the rushing upside back with Alvin Kamara this week with Derek Carr, and that's why he's going to be a must-start player. Carolina is dead last versus running backs in fantasy football. They've been just bleeding and gushing points to fantasy football running backs because their defense sucks and their run defense specifically sucks. So I see not only just one of these low floor games, like a 8-point fantasy game, or like even a 14 or 15 point game. I see a massive explosion game coming, and I'm telling you, under no circumstances can Alvin Kamara go to your bench. I know I just ranked Alvin Kamara not inside my top 5 this week in my fantasy rankings at running back. Alvin Kamara needs to go in your lineup regardless of situation this week. And our next guy right here, I'm doubling down on Ladd McConkey this week. Ladd McConkey, I think he's going to come out and have a good game again versus the Cleveland Browns in Cleveland. So obviously, Ladd McConkey has his true breakout game in Week 8. Round of applause for Ladd McConkey because it was awesome. Week 8 in a full PPR format. 29.1 fantasy points. And he caught all 6 targets for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, this was a massive revelation for Ladd McConkey because when you actually look at Ladd McConkey's game log, there's only been one game, and it was Week 2 versus Carolina when he's had less than 6 targets. Well, what happened in that Carolina game? They crushed them. They didn't need to throw the ball that much in that Week 2 game by the time the end of the third, early fourth quarter rolled around. So they just didn't need to target him that much. Other than that, though, he's been consistently targeted, but he hasn't been able to give you this kind of week. Most of the times he's getting like 5 or 6 catches for like 60 or 70 yards, and maybe he gets into the end zone. No, this guy broke off big plays finally, and that's the major revelation about this one. And Los Angeles Chargers, what they're doing and what we saw them do last week was they're opening up Herbert again. They're letting him throw the ball down the field a lot more often over the past several weeks. And the reason is because they're starting to show more dimensionality to this offense. It used to be, and I still think it is primarily, a run-first offense with Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman. But they're letting Justin Herbert open up the offense more because he's looked very good and he's still a really good quarterback with a massive arm to throw down the field. Cleveland is 27th versus the wide receiver position in fantasy. They've been ripped apart by tons of wide receivers this year, and I believe that this week Ladd exploits another weak defense against the pass because that's Cleveland's weakness, is against the pass on defense. I believe Ladd exploits this and has another big week in Week 9 fantasy football. I also have conviction on this one because you don't need to put 2 brain cells together to figure out CJ Stroud's projection on Underdog is a sweat-free projection. 0.5 total yards, you've got to take advantage of it. If you have not taken advantage of Underdog yet, go down in the comments and grab the link that's there and use code FVEN to sign up for Underdog. When you do that, you play the sweat-free projection this week for CJ Stroud, and they'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Going down to our next guy right here. I've got Chase Brown. Back this week, I think is going to be a really good play this week. Versus the Las Vegas Raiders, they are just, obviously, the Raiders are just a disaster of a team. But the Bengals really, like, their team has kind of become a disaster in their own way. Because obviously, expectations when you've got a quarterback like Joe Burrow are always really high. Well, what's been the one weakness this year? They can't establish a run, and their defense stinks. The offensive line is as bad as usual. That's not a surprise here. But Chase Brown, here's what my situation has been like with him. Obviously, I've been calling him the running back one in this offense for the past month. Well, he is that for sure. But I have been down on Chase Brown in fantasy football, specifically the last 2 weeks. So since he took over the backfield in Week 4 versus the Carolina Panthers, when you actually look at his game log, he's been low-key pretty good. Like, this guy's floor is actually relatively high. He hasn't had a massive explosion game yet, but his floor is actually pretty stable. 23.2 fantasy points, 16.4, 13.4, 7.3, 11.4 in a full PPR format. So again, a 7.3 point floor, that's actually really productive. That's like almost Brian Robinson Jr. type of production right here. The difference is that Brian Robinson Jr. has the name value and Chase Brown doesn't really have that name value here yet. So with Chase Brown also, he's handled at least 12 carries in all but one game this year, Week 6 at the New York Giants. The Giants defense is really good actually. They're low-key very good. Obviously, the Giants, they won that game, and he did get a big touchdown in that game to kind of seal the deal. But Chase Brown, realistically, has been pretty good in fantasy football all year, basically, since he took over this backfield. Obviously, the difference here, he gets the big break versus the Las Vegas Raiders, snapping a 2-game stretch where I haven't particularly loved the matchups. They are 25th versus the running back position in fantasy football. They give up tons of points, obviously. I actually expect this game to look very similar to what it looked like versus the Carolina Panthers in Week 4, where Chase Brown had 2 touchdowns in that game. I think this could be a very similar week. I think the Bengals will steamroll the Raiders defense here, and Chase Brown honestly might lead the way in a big way for the Bengals. Going to my quarterback start of the week, I am doubling down 2 weeks straight on Jordan Love. Obviously, it did not work out last week versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. There was an injury that obviously affected that, but even before he got injured, he really wasn't doing that well in fantasy. This week, he's playing Detroit. That's a much stiffer matchup here. So obviously, there's a bunch of things working against Jordan Love. Like I just said, he went down with injury. This is a groin strain, but according to MRI results, he did avoid major injury on this groin strain. That's obviously a very good positive mark that we can actually look at it and say, if any indication, that first injury he had to his knee, it only took him out for 2 games. So this guy has been playing unhealthy. You can actually see it if you watch the guy play. But he's been tough, and he still wants to go for his team. Reports are that he's determined to play. Shocker on that one. And that he will play, even if he's not 100%, which he probably will not be 100%. Now, he did miss Wednesday's practice, so that is of note. But if Jordan Love plays, I want to play him. Now, the first thing I'll say is expect an interception. That's been Jordan Love's MO. This dude is more Brett Favre than Aaron Rodgers. In Green Bay, he is a cowboy back there. He's a gunslinger, dude. This guy will throw into traffic of 4 guys. He doesn't care. His arm's that good. So a lot of times, every game, he's going to throw an interception, and Detroit's defense is also 12th versus quarterbacks. But here's the thing with Jordan Love. There's 2 stats that I particularly love this week with him. Only divisional game that Jordan Love has played this year versus the Minnesota Vikings, who at that time, their defense was looked at as virtually unbeatable. 30-plus point game in a 4-point passing touchdown format in fantasy football that week. He was lights out. And the lowest game at home for him this year has been 19.8 fantasy points in the same scoring format versus the Houston Texans in week 7. A massive game. Those are just ridiculous numbers that he's been able to do at home, and also when you factor in the division element of this. I think Detroit's got their hands full in this game, and this is a big fantasy matchup that I just want pieces of, and especially with Jordan Love at quarterback. And then our tight end start of the week. Same matchup. I want Sam Laporta in this matchup at Green Bay. Like I just said, this is a big fantasy week for points. I want opportunities in this matchup. There's going to be points everywhere in fantasy football. This is the biggest fantasy game in my opinion this particular week. So obviously a lot of, for most of the season, Sam Laporta has been kind of a bust. When you factor in his draft cost and what he's actually given you, it hasn't worked out to the tune of somebody like a Brock Bowers, who is a mid to late round pick and has been 10 times better than Sam Laporta. So people who drafted Sam Laporta and have been living with the results, they've made under the arrangements over the last month. Guys like Cole Kmet, Cade Otton, Tucker Kraft off the waiver wire. I'm telling you right now, cancel those arrangements for this week. You want Sam Laporta in this matchup. Best game of his season this past week versus the Tennessee Titans. 16.8 fantasy points in a full PPR format. Also, the most targets that he's had this year. 6 targets, and that was in a massive blowout. What's the key here? Why did he lead? Why did he have the most targets in any game last week? And why did he have his best fantasy week? The key is no Jameson Williams here. That's the key. No Jameson Williams again, serving out the last game of his 2-game suspension, and Green Bay is 26th versus the tight end position. You want options in this matchup, and I'm telling you, Sam Laporta is my tight end start of the week. So let me know how your team was looking so far this week, and if you want to see the top 30 running back rankings for this week, click on this video right here.